In today's video, we'll be creating an IAM user for our Next.js application so that it has permissions to upload files to our S3 bucket. At the end of this video, you have a better understanding of what an IAM user is, what are IAM policies, and what are the best ways to grant access to your AWS resources using infrastructure as code. So an IAM user, you can think of this as an entity in AWS that a web app or a user or a developer can assume. And here we're going to represent the IAM user with this key right here. With an IAM user, it doesn't have to be specifically a human or a person. You can refer to it as your Next.js application. You can refer to it as your backend service. You can refer to it as any entity that needs to assume this user role. Essentially, anyone that has access to this key right here can assume an IAM user. So in our example here, we want to create an IAM user specific for our Next.js application. And with this IAM user, you can attach different policies or permissions to grant access to specific AWS resources. Policies define what you can or cannot access in terms of AWS resources. And just to note, one IAM user can have multiple policies attached to it. So then I talked about an IAM user and different policies that you can attach to it, but how do you enable a person or a service, or in our case, our Next.js application, the ability to assume this user role? And the way that you would do this is through a thing called access keys. When you create an IAM user through infrastructure as code, you can also ask it to generate access keys. It'll grant you a public access key and also a secret access key. And anyone who has access to the secret access key can assume the role of your IAM user. So this is why that it's important when you generate secret keys that you don't publish it to GitHub and you don't expose it to anyone. And I really want to emphasize this, that anyone that has access to your secret key can assume the role of your user and all the policies attached to it. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to write infrastructure as code to define an IAM user for our Next.js application. And then we're going to give this IAM user the ability and the policies to upload images to our S3 bucket. And then when we do that, we'll also generate the access keys for this IAM user. And then with this access key, we can give it to our Next.js application to assume this user. So now you know how to create an IAM user, but how does AWS and S3 check that the request came from an application that has an IAM user? So when you created the IAM user and created the secret access key, you gave that access key to your Next.js application. And just remember, anyone that has access to your private access key can assume this user. When you upload an image onto your web app, Next.js will sign the request before sending it to S3, which is represented by this box here. S3 can verify that this request was signed by a user with a specific role. S3 has access to the private key for that specific user, so it can validate that this signature looks correct on their end. So once S3 verifies that this Next.js application is actually this user, it then checks the policies of what this user can do. Here, we stated that this user has access to upload images onto this S3 bucket. So at the end of all this, S3 can verify that this upload came from a trusted user, and it will accept the upload request. So now let's say there's a bad actor that's trying to make an upload request onto your S3 bucket, and it doesn't have your secret access key. When this bad actor makes the request to S3, S3 will check if the signature looks correct. Because that bad actor's access key doesn't correspond with any value with this IAM user, it'll reject the request. So this is how IAM users and policies work in AWS. It gives you a way to give specific entities like users, applications, or services specific access and permissions to different AWS resources. And we can do all this through infrastructure as code. So now that you understand IAM users, policies, and access keys, let's go ahead and create all this through Pulumi and infrastructure as code. So this is my Pulumi code where I'm writing all of my infrastructure as code. And in a previous video, we created the S3 bucket for our web app. So this is the list of things that I need to do in order to create an IAM user for my Next.js application to have access to my S3 bucket. We want a Next.js IAM user that has a policy to upload images to my S3 bucket here. And we also want the access keys here. So likewise, create IAM user, create policy to access S3 bucket, create the access keys, and then export the access keys. So now let's do Next.js app IAM user. So here I want to create an IAM user with this name. So now I want to create an IAM policy. Let me just ask cursor. I want to create and add a policy to grant load and read permission. All right, so I've written some code, so let me explain what's going on here. So here I created an IAM user, which corresponds with this value right here. And then here I'm creating a policy to allow read-write access to my S3 bucket. So that's this portion right here. So here, I'm only defining the policy. I'm not attaching this policy to any person here. So here, I'm creating the policy and I'm giving the policy this name, RGB splitting user upload read-write policy, and then my current stack. So then here at policy equals, it's taking that S3 bucket that we created earlier, right? RGB splitting user upload bucket, and then it's extracting the ARN. ARN means Amazon resource number, I believe. And then it's going to apply this policy onto the bucket. So what we want is we're giving it a specific version. We're stating what kind of permissions and policies that we want to add. So here, we're allowing these actions on this S3 bucket. We're allowing S3 puts and gets. So then here with the resource, it's defining what AWS resource that we want these permissions to be applied upon. So then here in this case, this ARN is being taken from the S3 bucket here. To summarize, we are creating a policy and we're naming it this. And then we're grabbing the S3 bucket ARN and then we're applying this policy onto it. We're allowing S3 puts and gets on this S3 bucket ARN /star, which means everything in this bucket. /star is a wildcard. So now we've created the user and we created the policy, but we haven't attached that policy to the specific user. So then here in user policy attachment, what we're doing here is we're getting the Next.js app IAM user. So this user that we created here, and we're grabbing the name from it. And we want to attach to it this policy ARN. So this policy that we just created here, we're getting the ARN and then we're attaching it to our IAM user. So now it'll look like this, right? Where we've created our IAM user and then we're attaching it this policy here so that it can have read-write access to our S3 bucket. All right, so then the last thing we want to do is to create the access keys. So this is the name we're going to give it, Next.js app access key, and then the stack we're in, and then user will equal the Next.js IAM user. So that is the IAM user that we created here earlier. So the next thing we want to do is we want to export the access key and the secret access key so that we can access it through the terminal. Before we deploy all this to our AWS account, let's just walk through everything that we've written down so far. So here I am creating an IAM user with the name Next.js app user and a specific stack that I'm in. So dev, gamma, prod, so forth. And then here I am creating an IAM policy to allow read writes onto my S3 bucket. Here I'm getting the ARN of the S3 bucket that we created earlier. And I'm extracting the ARN and then I'm applying this IAM policy. And what it's doing is we're allowing this statement to allow S3 put object and S3 get object these specific actions. We're allowing those actions on this AWS resource, the ARN, which is the S3 bucket here. And with this IAM user and IAM policy, they are isolated from each other. So now we want a way to attach that policy onto our IAM user. So that's what this part's doing here. We are getting the name of the IAM user we want to attach a policy to, and then we're getting the IAM policy ARN, which we just created here. And then lastly, we're creating access keys so that we can give the secret access key to our Next.js application to assume this user. So with all of that, let's go ahead and deploy this to our AWS account. So I run Pulumi up, and then you'll see that these are all the things that are being created here. So I'm creating an IAM user named Next.js app user, creating access key, creating a policy, and I'm attaching a user policy as well. So let's go ahead and deploy this. And then bam, all of our resources are now deployed. So let's go ahead and log into the AWS console and check all this out. All right, so here I'm logged into my AWS account. And the first thing we created was an IAM user. So let's go ahead and go into IAM here to see if this user got created. I click on IAM, then click on users, and then I see here that I have my Next.js app user dev created here. And then if I click on this user, you'll see that I have a policy here named RGB splitting user upload rewrite policy. And then when you click on that permission in that policy, it also verifies that this IAM policy got created as well. So then if I click on policy versions and then I click on this plus sign, you'll see that this IAM policy got created to allow puts and gets on my S3 bucket here, which is identical to what we defined here as well. So now we verified that we were able to create the user, the policy got created, and we attached the policy to that specific IAM user. So I think the last thing I want to check is if the access keys got created as well. Go to users, go to this person here, and then I click security credentials. You'll see that I have access keys created here. All right, so here I'm exporting a thing called Next.js app IAM user access key ID. So then if I copy this and then I type in Pulumi stack output and then Next.js app IAM user access key ID, if I type that out, it outputs my access key ID. So when you type in Pulumi stack output and then your secret key here, it's going to output the secret tag here. And I believe this just makes it so that you don't accidentally leak your keys. But if you type in show secrets, it should output this into the terminal. So a reminder for myself to blur this out and to not leak this. I have access to my secret key now here, which is great. So then with that, we've done everything that we needed to create an IAM user for our Next.js application to have read-write access to our S3 bucket. And then we also created the access keys that we can give to our Next.js application so that it can assume that IAM user. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can securely give your Next.js application access to your secret keys and how to do it for your dev, beta, and production environments, which will involve configuring your Vercel deployments to have access to those keys. So with that, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.